On a quiet stretch of Sugar Hill Road, a young mother and her little boy were found murdered inside their home, an act so brutal it shook the small town of Heflin, Alabama, to its core. For more than 20 years, the case sat in the shadows, waiting for someone to speak, and in 2023, someone finally did. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this deep dive into unsolved mysteries, please hit that like button and subscribe. Leave a comment where you're watching from, and what time it is. But what really happened inside that house over that long September weekend? The weekend had passed without much notice in Heflin, Alabama. Sugar Hill Road was still and ordinary, framed by rustling oaks and the soft creak of front porch swings. It was September 2002, and for 23-year-old Monica Rollins, life revolved around her children. Neighbors recalled seeing her in the yard just days earlier, her arms cradling her pregnant belly, her 2 young sons playing nearby. She was quiet but kind, always with a tired smile. No arguments, no trouble. Just the usual sounds of a young family settling into another fall weekend. But by Monday morning, something was off. A friend, concerned after not hearing from Monica since late Friday, decided to stop by. The house on Sugar Hill Road looked undisturbed from the outside. The car was in the driveway. Toys still scattered the lawn. Nothing appeared out of place, but the front door was unlocked. Inside, the air was heavy and silent. No laughter, no cartoons playing, no cries from a baby or rustling of little feet, just a chilling stillness. The friend moved cautiously through the house, calling out Monica's name. Then they saw her. Monica was lying on the floor, unresponsive, brutally attacked. Her lifeless body bore the marks of a vicious assault. Near her was the small form of her 6-year-old son, Dalton. He too had been murdered, his final moments stolen in what could only be described as an explosion of violence. But that wasn't all. Monica had been 36 weeks pregnant. Investigators would later determine that the trauma she endured caused her to go into premature labor. The baby, a boy, never had a chance. He was partially delivered at the scene, a heartbreaking testament to a life that was ending just as another was meant to begin. Then came the most unexpected discovery. As first responders swept the home, they opened a closet door and found Monica's youngest son, just 2 years old, huddled inside. He had survived the entire ordeal, alone, hungry, scared. He'd stayed hidden in the darkness for possibly 2 days, silent as the world outside tried to make sense of what had happened inside those walls. The discovery of a sole survivor gave the scene a surreal, almost cinematic horror. It wasn't just the brutality, it was the mystery. No broken windows, no forced entry, no screams reported. The killer had come and gone, leaving a trail of death and sorrow behind. But no answers. Police were left with a horrific scene. 3 lives ended, and a toddler who couldn't explain what he'd seen. The killer had vanished without a trace. No witnesses. No clear motive. Just silence. And as investigators stood in that small home, grappling with the carnage left behind, one question grew louder than the rest. How could something this evil happen and leave behind so little? And more urgently, had the killer planned to return? Word of the murders spread through Heflin faster than anything had in years. In a town where everyone knew everyone else, and most people left their doors unlocked, it felt like a tear had opened in the very fabric of safety. Neighbors clutched their children tighter. Porch lights stayed on long after dark. Churches filled with quiet prayers and whispered questions. What had happened to Monica and Dalton Rollins was not just tragic. It was unthinkable. Within hours, police cruisers lined Sugar Hill Road. The yellow tape around the modest home was more than just a crime scene. It became a symbol of fear. Monica, just 23 and on the verge of welcoming her 3rd child, had been violently murdered. Her 6-year-old son, Dalton, had been taken alongside her. It wasn't a random accident. It was something personal. Or maybe it wasn't. That was what disturbed everyone most. Investigators worked tirelessly to reconstruct Monica's final hours. They spoke to family, friends, co-workers, anyone who had seen or heard from her that weekend. But there were no frantic voicemails, no strange texts, no neighbors recalling a car parked too long near the house. Her weekend had seemed perfectly ordinary. Until it wasn't. Theories began to swirl, some rooted in fact, others in fear. Some believed the killer had known Monica. Maybe an old flame. Maybe someone who couldn't accept she'd moved on. Others wondered if it had been random, a drifter or stranger who'd noticed a vulnerable home and struck without warning. A few even whispered about her pregnancy. Could that have been the trigger? Could the unborn child have made her a target? But the lack of any clear motive only deepened the dread. If it wasn't personal, that meant it could happen to anyone. Amid the uncertainty, crime scene technicians combed the home meticulously. They gathered samples, DNA swabs, hair strands, partial fingerprints, and fiber evidence. In 2002, that kind of forensic evidence felt promising. But results didn't come in hours or days. Processing took weeks, sometimes months, and even then, only if there was a match. At the time, DNA databases were still developing. Many states hadn't yet adopted laws requiring felons to submit samples. There were thousands of unidentified genetic profiles in the system, but no easy way to tie them to names. So investigators stored what they had, documenting every piece of evidence with the hope that one day technology would catch up. In the meantime, they went door to door, asking the same painful question in different ways. Had anyone seen anything unusual? A car that didn't belong? A shadow in the woods? Even a noise in the night? Almost every answer came back the same. No. Nothing. Just a normal, quiet weekend in Heflin. Which meant the killer had moved through the neighborhood like a ghost, seen by no one, heard by no one, remembered by no one. But detectives weren't ready to let go of their one advantage, the evidence left behind. Because in every violent act, no matter how careful the killer, something slips. And someone had slipped inside that house. Inside the Rollins home, the horror of what had occurred was matched only by the eerie stillness that lingered afterward. For detectives, every detail told part of a story, but that story refused to take shape. The scene was bloody. Yes, violent, devastating. But it was also strangely restrained. There were no broken windows, no shattered glass, no drawers yanked open in a frenzy. Nothing stolen. Monica's purse, keys, even small electronics were untouched. That ruled out burglary. And if it wasn't robbery, then what was it? Detectives began forming early theories. Whoever did this had either been let in willingly or knew how to gain entry without alerting anyone. It was a chilling realization. The killer hadn't crashed in like a stranger. They had moved with familiarity, comfort, possibly even confidence. And then there was the level of violence. Monica had suffered multiple stab wounds, deep, targeted, deliberate. Dalton, too, had been attacked with the same brutality. But the baby, the unborn child, had never taken a breath. Monica had gone into labor during the attack, a trauma so severe that her body gave out before it could protect her child. For the investigators standing over that scene, it felt less like a murder and more like a massacre. But why? They turned to Monica's life. She had no history of trouble, no documented threats, no restraining orders. She wasn't involved in drugs, had no known enemies, and no custody disputes over her children. Everyone they interviewed said the same thing. She was a good mother, quiet, focused on her kids. If anything, she lived a life too small, too centered on family, for this kind of violence to make any sense. Still, they had to ask hard questions. Detectives pulled names from her past, Old boyfriends, distant relatives, former co-workers. Anyone who had passed through Monica's life in the last few years was considered. They were looking for someone with a temper, someone who might have harbored resentment, someone who knew the layout of her home. They ran background checks, interviewed people as far away as Georgia and Mississippi. A few names raised eyebrows. A couple had minor criminal records. One had once served time for assault. But each lead dissolved under scrutiny. Alibis checked out. Stories held. Nothing placed them at the house that weekend. It became a cycle of building and dismantling. Hopes raised, then dashed. Every thread they pulled unraveled into nothing. Still, the detectives were meticulous. Every piece of evidence gathered was preserved. DNA swabs were labeled and stored. Partial fingerprints lifted from surfaces. Microscopic fibers collected from clothing, carpets, furniture. Even trace hair strands that couldn't be linked at the time were kept safe. Because the investigators had faith, if not in immediate justice, then in the slow march of science. But that patience was double-edged. As days became weeks and weeks became months, the lack of movement weighed heavy. People began asking new questions, not just, who did this, but will they do it again? If this killer had acted once with such ferocity, was this a singular eruption or the first act of something darker? Was the person who entered Monica Rollins' home that night someone driven by personal rage? Or someone who had killed before and would kill again? Suspects tend to fall into categories. Those closest to the victim, those with the opportunity, and those who simply fit a pattern too familiar to ignore. In the aftermath of Monica and Dalton Rollins' murders, detectives began mapping out each of these categories, but almost immediately the boundaries blurred. There were no easy answers, no boyfriend with a violent past, no neighbor with a suspicious schedule. Instead, the investigation produced a handful of names, some known to Monica, some barely more than shadows from her periphery. A few had troubling backgrounds. One had a criminal record involving minor assaults. Another had once been questioned in an unrelated domestic case. One had briefly worked near the area. All were male. All on paper seemed like possibilities. And yet, one by one, they unraveled. Detectives tracked their alibis, ran their fingerprints, cross-referenced timelines. They drove hundreds of miles to ask questions in person. They brought in experts to analyze behavior, poring over interview transcripts and psychological profiles. Some suspects agreed to polygraphs. Others avoided calls entirely, but nothing connected any of them to the home on Sugar Hill Road. No one could be placed at the scene during that September weekend. Then came the forensic comparison stage. The fingerprints found at the scene were partial, incomplete. Too smudged to make an immediate match, yet distinct enough to preserve for future testing. The DNA swabs, taken from under Monica's fingernails, from clothing, from bathroom surfaces, were processed, but the results sat in a digital limbo. No hits, not in 2002, not in 2003, not for years. Still, detectives pushed forward, slowly eliminating suspects from their growing board. And as each name was crossed off, the frustration deepened. The nature of the crime kept returning in their conversations. It hadn't been frenzied. There was no chaotic break-in, no erratic pattern. This was not the wild panic of a burglar caught off guard, nor did it carry the hallmarks of a practiced serial offender. There were no taunts left behind, no escalation in the public. It was controlled, brutal, focused, and then nothing. No follow-up attacks, no similar crimes in neighboring counties, no known pattern that matched. Some detectives began to fear the worst kind of killer, the one who strikes once, for reasons known only to themselves, and disappears back into society unnoticed. Over time, tips still trickled in. A co-worker mentioned seeing someone unusual around Monica's place weeks earlier. A local woman called in a name she thought she overheard at a bar. Every lead became another rabbit hole, and with each one, the case file grew thicker, but not clearer. The town's early panic slowly calcified into resignation. For most people, the fear became manageable. But inside the Heflin Police Department, a quiet vow remained. They would not let this case grow cold. Not truly. Not while evidence remained on the shelf and unanswered questions sat in the files. Then, nearly 2 decades later, something small happened. It was a cross-reference check, routine in most departments, often yielding nothing. But this one brought up a name from deep within the original suspect list, a man who'd slipped off the radar years ago. His file had been thin. Nothing had linked him definitively to Monica. And yet there it was. His name, connected to a new piece of data, a prison record. Out of state, his name was Louis Landon Spivey. And the question investigators now faced wasn't whether he'd resurfaced, it was why. The years after the murders stretched on like a shadow over Heflin. Each passing season brought another birthday uncelebrated, another empty chair at the dinner table, another milestone Monica and Dalton would never reach. Holidays were the hardest. For Monica's family, Christmas came with fewer lights, Halloween passed without costumes, and every September the air felt heavier. Quiet reminders of the weekend that had stolen everything. Dalton's classmates grew up. They graduated, got jobs, started families. But many still remembered the boy with the bright eyes and easy laugh. His name came up in hushed conversations, in yearbooks marked by a tiny memorial, in quiet reunions where someone always asked, "Do you remember Dalton Rollins?" Sugar Hill Road changed too. It became a place avoided, not from danger, but from grief. The house eventually emptied, the yard went quiet. Locals passed by a little faster. Some turned their heads, some whispered. The Rollins home stood like a frozen moment in time. Back at the Heflin Police Department, the case never truly left. Detectives moved on or retired, but the file remained. Thick, intact, a reminder. As forensic science advanced, the evidence, carefully preserved, was sent for reanalysis. DNA labs were faster now. Databases had grown. Technology could extract more from less. But each time results came back, they offered the same cold echo. No match. Partial, inconclusive, insufficient. It was like chasing a shadow through fog. Still, every few years, a new detective would inherit the file. Each one brought hope. A fresh set of eyes. New questions. Sometimes they'd spot a detail overlooked. Other times they'd simply confirm what the last had seen. Leads would flare up, only to fade out again. And through it all, the family waited. Monica's parents, aging with time. Dalton's little brother, growing up in the long shadow of what had happened. No matter how much time passed, the pain didn't soften. It just became quieter. The grief, less spoken, still lived in every missed moment. By 2021, 2 decades had passed. The case was old enough to feel distant, cold enough to be forgotten by many. But inside the department, something had changed. A new police chief had taken over, young, methodical, and relentless. Alongside Captain Scott Bonner, he reviewed old files with a single goal: reopen the case. They didn't want headlines. They wanted justice. So they pulled out everything: crime scene photos, lab reports, witness interviews, and most importantly, the old suspect list. Then came the call. It wasn't a dramatic tip or hidden clue, just a quiet update from a cross-state check. One of their old persons of interest, someone who'd once barely registered as a blip on the radar, was serving time in a Florida prison. His name had appeared during a routine inquiry. It wasn't what he'd done recently that drew their attention. It was what he hadn't done 20 years ago. And without knowing it, Lewis Landon Spivey was about to walk straight into a storm. By 2021, the Rollins case file was no longer just a historical document. It was an open investigation once again. After nearly 2 decades of quiet frustration, the Heflin Police Department made the decision to re-engage, not with hope, but with determination. A generation of tools had changed since 2002. Science had evolved. And maybe, just maybe, the killer had left behind more than silence. Captain Scott Bonner and the new police chief ordered a full re-examination. Everything from the crime scene, DNA samples, partial prints, carpet fibers, skin cells under Monica's fingernails, was carefully logged and shipped to both state and private labs. The process was slow, painstaking, but this time they weren't just hoping for a name. They were rebuilding the entire picture, layer by layer, through modern forensics. The breakthrough didn't come from a lab result. It came from a name, Lewis Landon Spivey. A man whose name had appeared faintly in the original case files, someone barely flagged during the early investigation. Back then, there hadn't been enough to pursue him. But in 2021, his name surfaced in a very different context. Spivey was serving time in a Florida prison, a 15-year sentence, unrelated charges, but his criminal history was disturbing. Assaults, burglary, resisting arrest. He'd moved between Alabama and Florida during the early 2000s, and during the time Monica Rollins was murdered, he was living within driving distance of Heflin. His background wasn't the only reason for interest. There were small details, timelines that matched up just closely enough to feel suspicious. Connections to others in the area. Potential links to Monica's extended social circle, however distant. Enough red flags to draw attention, even if they weren't enough to arrest him. So the investigators began digging. They reached out to the Florida Department of Corrections, requested records, transfer logs, visitor histories, any documents that could shed light on where Spivey had been and who he'd been in contact with. They studied his prison behavior, disciplinary records, and mental health evaluations. Everything was reviewed with one thought in mind. Was this the man who had walked into the Rollins home and ended 3 lives? The deeper they looked, the more troubling it became. Spivey had a documented history of violent outbursts. He'd been flagged for manipulative behavior behind bars. One incident involved a verbal confrontation that included threats with unsettlingly specific language. And then there was geography. Spivey had ties to rural Alabama. He knew the terrain. He knew people who lived in Cleburne County. By late 2022, one thing was clear. They had to talk to him. They waited, bided their time. And in June 2023, when Spivey was scheduled for release from prison, Alabama authorities were there to meet him. They expected resistance, deflection, denial. What they got instead was readiness. Spivey didn't run, didn't protest. He sat down and started talking, not in riddles, not in pieces, but fully, calmly, almost deliberately. What he told investigators over the next few hours would send shockwaves through every department that had touched the case, because for the first time in 21 years, someone was about to say out loud what happened in that house on Sugar Hill Road, and he claimed it was all his doing. Lewis Landon Spivey didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't demand a deal. He didn't even flinch. The moment investigators sat down across from him, he spoke with an unsettling calm, as if the words had been waiting just beneath the surface for years. He didn't need to be prompted. He knew why they were there, and what followed was the kind of confession detectives rarely hear, detailed, unflinching, and horrifyingly specific. He began by describing the Rollins home, not just its location, but the layout, the number of rooms, the angles of entry, the way the front door stuck slightly when pushed open. He remembered the smell. He remembered the dimness of the hallway. Then he described Monica. He claimed there was no long-standing grudge, no deep personal motive. He said he was angry, disconnected, looking to lash out. And for reasons even he couldn't fully explain, Monica Rollins' home became his target. He recalled confronting her inside the house. Monica startled, shielding herself, trying to protect her children. He said she begged him to leave, pleaded. But something snapped inside him. He told investigators how the attack escalated quickly, how Dalton had come running, trying to reach his mother, how the boy had screamed, fought back, even bit his arm, and how that defiance, that tiny act of courage from a 6-year-old, had sealed his fate. He described how Monica, heavily pregnant, had collapsed during the assault, how he left her gasping for breath, and how he walked out without looking back, stepping over the broken family he had just destroyed. The details he gave were things that had never been made public. The positioning of the bodies, the location of a small toy found next to Dalton. The fact that Monica's phone had been unplugged, not smashed. Investigators knew then. There was no doubt. Only the killer could know these things. Spivey admitted everything. No accomplices, no claims of memory loss, no attempts to soften what he'd done. It was as if he wanted to empty the burden all at once, as if carrying it had become heavier than serving time. He didn't offer much in the way of motive. He said only that he'd been a different person then. That anger controlled him, that he'd spent 20 years in prison for other crimes, and none of them had haunted him the way the Rollins case had. Investigators recorded every word, cross-referenced every confession detail against evidence preserved since 2002. It all aligned. The confession solved the case, but left one haunting question behind. Why now? What had changed in Spivey's mind? Was it guilt? A need to cleanse his conscience before being released into the world again? Or was it something darker? A final play for control over the story he had tried to bury. With his confession recorded in full, Louis Landon Spivey was placed into custody and quickly extradited from Florida to Alabama to face justice for the murders of Monica and Dalton Rollins. The journey home wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. For more than 2 decades, this man's name had lingered quietly in the case files, barely noticeable. Now he was in shackles, facing the weight of the crimes he had once walked away from. At the bond hearing, the courtroom was filled with emotion. Family members, retired officers, reporters who had followed the case since 2002. The judge ruled under Alabama's Aniah's Law, a statute allowing violent offenders to be held without bond before trial. The details of the case met every criteria. Spivey would remain behind bars until the legal system could carry out the final stages of accountability. For Monica's surviving family, the moment marked a turning point. For years, they had lived under the ache of not knowing who had done it, why, and whether that person would ever be held responsible. There were days they'd tried to move on. Other days, they couldn't think of anything else. Now, for the first time since that awful weekend in 2002, the weight began to lift. Justice was no longer a distant hope. It was real. And it had a name. The town of Heflin, though hardened by the years, reacted with a deep mix of grief and relief. The grief was still raw. Nothing would bring Monica or her children back. Nothing could erase the pain of 20 years spent in the dark. But there was relief in answers. Relief in knowing the man who had caused so much devastation would never again walk their streets. Law enforcement officials held a press conference shortly after the arrest. Captain Scott Bonner stood beside Chief McLaughlin, both visibly emotional. They thanked the community for 2 decades of prayers, tips, and patience. They praised the persistence of forensic experts who had carefully preserved the evidence. They honored the determination of the officers who had refused to let the case grow cold. More than anything, they spoke to the heart of the matter. Monica and Dalton had never been forgotten. The press conference was broadcast across the state. It reached people who had once lived in Heflin, people who had gone to school with Dalton, people who remembered the yellow tape around the little house on Sugar Hill Road. The resolution sparked reflection on how long justice can take and how much pain lingers in its absence. But as the case prepared to enter the courtroom phase, one truth stood above the rest. This was never just about prosecution. It was about restoration, about giving a family back their truth. Still, another question lingered, one that couldn't be answered by a gavel or a sentence. What does justice mean when it arrives decades late? Is it enough to hear the words guilty after so many birthdays missed, so many milestones lost? Can truth heal what time has worn away? Or is justice in cases like this simply the light that breaks the silence? The confession brought justice, but justice rarely feels clean. Monica Rollins' family had waited more than 20 years for this moment, to hear someone take responsibility for the horror that had shattered their lives. The arrest of Louis Landon Spivey brought clarity to questions that had lingered in every corner of their home, their memories, their grief. But closure is not the same as healing. Monica's surviving children grew up in the shadow of a crime they barely understood. They knew only that something terrible had happened, something that took their mother, their brother, and the baby who was never born. No bedtime story could erase that. No answer, even years later, could restore what was taken. In Heflin, Sugar Hill Road became more than just a location. It became a symbol. A quiet reminder that darkness doesn't always announce itself. That tragedy can unfold without warning. Even on the most ordinary streets. For decades the house sat still. The whispers faded, but the memory never did. And among the officers who had once walked through that blood-stained house, the weight never truly left. Some retired before the case was solved. Others carried it in silence, replaying evidence logs in their heads, wondering what they missed. For many, the case had become personal. It wasn't just about catching a killer. It was about protecting the memory of a young mother and 2 innocent children. The resolution proved something essential. Time doesn't erase truth. It only buries it deeper. But when someone is willing to keep digging, when persistence outlasts resignation, truth has a way of resurfacing. Forensics evolved. Technology changed. But it was human tenacity that brought this case home. The evidence had always been there. It just needed someone to look again, someone to reopen the file, someone to ask, what if we missed something? In solving the murders of Monica and Dalton Rollins, the investigators gave the town of Heflin something it hadn't felt in years. Peace, not complete, not perfect, but peace nonetheless. Still, as the file was finally marked closed, a deeper question remained. How many more stories like this one still sit in the quiet corners of police archives? How many names are waiting in boxes, preserved in fading ink and old tape? How many families still carry the weight of silence, unaware that a single clue could one day change everything? Justice came to Sugar Hill Road, but the legacy it left behind is a reminder that the past is never fully buried. Sometimes, all it takes is someone willing to open the file. For more than 2 decades, the murders of Monica Rollins, her son Dalton, and her unborn child cast a long, unyielding shadow over Heflin, Alabama. The case became more than a mystery. It became a wound, one that investigators carried in folders, one that a community carried in silence, and one that a family carried in every birthday missed, every graduation without a mother's hug, every year that passed without answers. Detectives pursued the case long after most would have set it aside. Neighbors who once brought flowers now brought quiet prayers. Even strangers who stumbled upon the story years later found themselves pulled into the gravity of a crime that never made sense. Then, when it seemed the silence might last forever, one voice broke through. Louis Landon Spivey's confession did not rewrite what happened. It did not undo the horror or restore what was lost. But it delivered something just as sacred: truth. After years of chasing shadows, the Rollins family finally had certainty. The question of who was no longer a question. This case stands as proof that justice can take its time. But it doesn't forget. And in that long-awaited truth, the Rollins family found something they hadn't had since 2002. A beginning to peace. If this case moved you, take a second to share your thoughts in the comments below. Every story deserves to be remembered.